Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2012 Dahrendorf Lecture in memory of this college's third warden, Ralf Dahrendorf. I'm delighted to welcome several members of the Dahrendorf family here today. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. I'd also like particularly to recognize Professor Michael Goering of the Zeit Foundation in Hamburg, to which Ralf Dahrendorf was very closely connected and which has been a great friend of the Dahrendorf program. I think it's no exaggeration to say that our lecturer this evening is the most influential philosophical exponent of liberalism in the world today. That's certainly true in the English-speaking world, almost certainly in the wider West, but even beyond the traditional West. I was just recalling that we met quite by chance in the foyer of a grand hotel in Beijing, where some senior members of the Chinese academic establishment had asked Professor Dworkin to explain to them this apparently somewhat unfamiliar concept of liberalism. For more than 40 years, Professor Dworkin has developed, elaborated, refined a consistent account of modern egalitarian liberalism, particularly in the field of philosophy of law, but by no means only. Many of us will remember a conference in this very room 3 years ago, which resulted in this publication you can pick up outside called Liberalisms in East and West, in which after 2 days in which we had explored all the multiple complexities of liberalisms in different parts of the world and the many, many meanings of the term, at the very end Professor Dworkin stood up and told us exactly what liberalism is in the singular, in a really magnificent account, which has now culminated in this book, Justice for Hedgehogs. The word magisterial is much overused, like the word revolution, but this is truly a magisterial book, immensely learned, lucid, wide-ranging, and also strikingly moving in its reflections on how a good and meaningful life might be lived, reflections from perhaps a slightly later stage than some people in this room. And therefore there could be no speaker better qualified to address us today on the question of how universal is liberalism. We're also extremely fortunate in our respondent, our own Professor Sir Adam Roberts, President of the British Academy, Emeritus Professor of International Relations in this university, the doyen of international relations in Britain. Many of us will recall, Adam, your retirement seminar, if retirement is exactly the right word, were followed, which was in a sense all about this question. It was about what we call complex universalism and the question how you build a liberal international order, the subject on which Professor Roberts is currently writing a book, in a world of very different cultures and civilizations, and a world in which non-Western powers are becoming more powerful and arguably trying to spread their own rather different norms. So no one could be better qualified to respond from the perspective of international relations. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming this year's Dahrendorf Lecture, Professor Ronald Dworkin.
Thank you. No, I have to turn this on, sorry. Can I be heard now in the back? Thank you, Tim, for that extraordinary introduction. Undeserved, but nevertheless very welcome. Particularly considering its source. Our topic, as Tim said, is liberalism, a political creed. The creed of Ralf Dahrendorf, the creed that I would venture to say most of us here endorse. Our question is about the scope of liberalism's domain, its authority. Is liberalism a required political morality everywhere there are human beings, so that a society in which women are subordinated, or there's grotesque inequality of wealth, or people are required to worship in a certain way, or politics is one party, if any party, can we say of such places that they are illegitimate because illiberal? Or on the contrary, should we say that liberalism is a mandatory political morality only in those communities in which liberalism resonates with shared understanding and shared tradition? That would be the view that liberalism is only parochial, not universal, and is, moreover, parochial to only a relatively few political communities in the world. The question is, which of these two views is right? Politicians in the West, particularly in my country, strongly support the universal view. They say we should export our values, and they speak famous line now, a very long time ago, we should make the world safe for democracy, by which was meant we should make the world safe for our conception of democracy. But the rival view, the view that liberalism only has a parochial grip, is held by a great many scholars and is held in a range of sophistication. There are, for example, cultural anthropologists who say that a political morality can't be true absolutely, it can only be true for those communities in which it has roots. There are more sophisticated versions of this idea. One developed by Isaiah Berlin has proved particularly influential, and it's to be called, as he called it, pluralism. Let me read one of his statements, a piece he wrote in the New York Review of Books. I came to the conclusion that there is a plurality of ideals as there is a plurality of cultures and of temperaments. I believe that there is a plurality of values which men can and do seek, and that these values differ. There is not, typical Berlin statement this, there is not an infinity of them. The number of human values, of values that I can pursue while maintaining my human semblance, my human character, is finite. Let us say 74, or 122, or 26, or some other number, but finite, whatever it may be. And the difference it makes is that if a man pursues one of these values, I, who do not, am able to understand why he pursues it, or what it would be like in his circumstances for me to be induced to pursue it. Now, John Rawls, certainly the most influential political philosopher of our time, endorsed Berlin's view in Rawls's mature later book, Political Liberalism, and he quoted the following further passage from Isaiah Berlin. The realm of values is objective, but values clash, and the full range of values is too extensive to fit into any one social world. Not only are they incompatible with one another, imposing conflicting requirements on institutions, but there exists no family of workable institutions that can allow sufficient space for them all. A just liberal society may have far more space than other social worlds, but it can never be without loss. The basic error is to think that because values are objective and hence truly values, they must be compatible. In the realm of values as opposed to the world of fact, not all truths can fit into one social world. Well, that is an elegant, very refined statement of the parochial view. It is the view that I wish to contest. I want to argue that liberalism is a universal creed. Universal in the sense that if it's true for anyone, it's true for everyone. But we have to pause now. I've been speaking as if it was perfectly clear what liberalism is. I said it was a political creed. But there are many different theories, some radically different from another, that people have called liberalism. And the ambiguity, or at least abstraction of these views, has caused trouble. I remember that when I first came to Oxford as a student, I was asked, "What are your political views?" I said, "I am a liberal." Very unexpected reaction. All the nice, scruffy, bearded people shunned me. The toffs, as I later learned to call them, thought I was all right. In America now, liberalism is a pejorative term. No politician running for office, for the office of president certainly, since Michael Dukakis would announce that he is a liberal. Obama calls himself a progressive, but I don't think he uses the word liberal. I have on my shelves a book whose title is How to Speak to a Liberal If You Must. Now let's distinguish between types of liberalism. Let's try and disambiguate the term. There is what we might call minimal liberalism. This is the view that ultimate political power should rest in the people as a whole rather than in a monarch or in oligarchs. That view is compatible with no constraint at all on what the people may do. Another form of liberalism, often called classical liberalism or even Manchester liberalism, adds to the requirement of popular sovereignty certain rights. Eminent among these are economic rights, free trade, a free market, no redistribution that dishonors the result of a free market. Also, what have come to be called liberal negative rights, freedom of speech, for example, certain degree of privacy, rule of law, fair trials, and so forth. The third kind of liberalism, the liberalism so dishonored in the United States now, is egalitarian liberalism, or as it's often called in Europe, social democracy. And this adds to the economic rights and the negative rights, derogating from the economic rights to the extent necessary, rights to economic equality and rights to social equality, favoring redistribution in search of greater equality and favoring government constraints to protect social equality, to guard against discriminations of various kinds. Now, we have these three, and there are more accounts of what liberalism is. As Tim said, I think there's a right answer to this question, and I'll try and say what I think it is. But we should notice a temptation. Many people have succumbed to it. The temptation in the face of ambiguity or conflict in a shared political value is to recommend junking the term, not worrying about whether liberalism is universal or parochial, but asking much more concrete questions like, in what kind of society is a free press necessary? I think that's a mistake. Political concepts, justice, democracy, liberalism, those represent a kind of sharing of values. They represent values that we accept exist in some neighborhood, even though we disagree about precisely which values those are. And that makes possible a kind of discussion of the kind that, as Tim said, we had in this room last year, and which we might have this evening. How shall we understand what justice really is, or democracy really is, or in our case, what liberalism really is? I am therefore going to suggest that we raise the bar of abstraction. I'm going to offer two principles which I believe can be defended as basic liberal principles, principles that are shared among those who endorse or disparage particular, more concrete statements of what liberalism is. These are principles that I've defended before. They are, in fact, let loose at large in justice for hedgehogs. So I'm going to state them in a rather summary form this evening. The first basic principle of liberalism is that coercive government is illegitimate except on the assumption of equal concern for all those against whom dominion is exercised. Equal concern means that in political calculations, in the final overall decision of what to do in the coercive realm, everyone's fate counts the same. That's the first principle, the first of the basic liberal principles. The second is that coercive government is not legitimate unless it respects the right and responsibility of each individual to decide for himself or herself what counts or would count as success in living, what would count as a good life. That is a decision, according to the second liberal principle, that must be left to individuals one by one. That, of course, is not the decision what economic system to impose, what criminal law to have. It holds only for each person's decision, a decision that must be taken into effect by equal concern as to what success in living would be for that person. Now, one or two comments about these two principles. As I say, I've argued for them and tried to make them more developed elsewhere. But one thing it's important to remember is that these are principles about the necessary conditions of legitimate coercion. They are not principles of individual morality. I am not required by any moral code to have equal concern for your children as I have for my children. I am certainly not required to respect your idea of what a good life would consist in. I may, in fact, hold that view in contempt and try to persuade you out of it. These are principles only about the conditions of collective coercion. Secondly, just part of that first, I suppose, these are positions about coercion not persuasion. Doesn't follow from these liberal principles that government may not endorse particular values, may not, for example, construct museums and select which art is protected in which museums. These are about direct coercion of individuals. Now, the third and most important point about these basic liberal principles is that they are both imperative. It's perfectly true that the first principle of equal concern sounds like equality, and the second principle of respect for people's autonomy sounds like liberty. And it's an old idea in political morality that liberty and equality must one day conflict, and that governments must be free to choose among them. Value pluralism, the view endorsed by Berlin and Rawls, takes as its paradigm instance the supposed conflict between liberty and equality. As I've stated these principles, liberalism denies that these are principles that can be compromised, one to the benefit of another. They are both imperative because they state the conditions of human dignity, and dignity is not for compromise. But how do we apply them together? Through interpretation. We must arrive at an understanding of what equal concern requires that is consistent with respecting individual autonomy. We must correspondingly develop a sense of what autonomy requires that is consistent with our understanding of equal concern. We must approach political morality as a problem calling for a solution to simultaneous equations. How might that go? I'll summarize two important consequences of seeing these as principles with simultaneous demands. The first, a theory of distributive justice. Society has resources, develops these resources through commerce and trade and production. How shall the consequences be distributed? You might think that equal concern for the fate of everybody will require a distribution in which everyone has, in the end, the same wealth, without regard to skill, without regard to luck, without regard to choices of occupation or work as against leisure, investment as against consumption. You might think that equal concern would require what's sometimes called flat equality. But we can see quite quickly, can't we, that that understanding of equal concern would destroy the second liberal principle, because it would deny individual responsibility for all the kinds of decisions I've just mentioned. No, we cannot aim, if we want to take both principles on board, we cannot aim at equality of wealth ex post, that is, after all the decisions have been made, after the wheel has spun. But we can and must insist on equality ex ante, equality before the various decisions have been made. And that means that we must see distributive justice as guided by insurance, by asking, suppose before all of the decisions, all of the episodes of good and bad luck have been made, suppose people had equal wealth and could buy insurance against unemployment accident or disease on the same terms. Of course, that is an imaginary fantasy, but we can answer the question, suppose. And that question, though it can't be answered precisely, serves as an important guide to programs of distributive justice. I believe it can be seen, for example, as the skeletal model behind President Obama's Affordable Health Care Act. I'll say something about that in a few moments. Free speech, topic of our deliberations tomorrow. The two basic principles together demand a very generous understanding of free speech. The first principle of equal concern, requires not just equal concern in the economic distribution, it requires political equality, and political equality requires democracy, and democracy requires not just equal vote, but equal voice. And equal voice must mean that each citizen is free, not just to vote his own convictions, but to attempt in the fora of democratic argument to convince others to his view. And he must have that right, no matter how unwise or repellent or offensive his views may be. That is a condition of democracy, which is a condition of equal concern, and we must accept that with whatever price we must pay in injured feelings to secure it. The second principle, the second basic principle, also recommends a generous conception of free speech. It says people have the right and responsibility to form their own personalities, their own sense of what counts as good for them. And that, as sociologists have taught now for 2 generations, cannot be done by individuals just behind their own eyes. We form our personalities in society, and we form them by presenting ourselves to others as having the personality we wish to be understood to have. And again, this can't be done unless individuals are free to express their opinions, however unpopular, indeed, however repellent. Now, these are examples of the consequences that I believe follow from liberalism understood not in any particular concrete way, but understood as the 2 basic principles I've tried to describe. That is, understood in an abstract way. Now we come back to our question. Are the 2 principles, is liberalism so understood for everyone? Is it a universal creed or only parochial for those communities whose traditions endorse it? Of course, liberalism, the 2 principles, must be sensitive to the circumstances of a particular community. They must be sensitive to the wealth of the community. What equal concern requires by way of medical care must be different in a poor community from a rich one. And what counts as incitement to violence will depend upon vocabularies which differ from society to society. Our question is not, does liberalism have different consequences under different circumstances? It's rather the question, is liberalism itself, the 2 principles, true only for some communities and not for others? That is our question. We come now to what I believe is a very important juncture. I wish to argue that though political morality may be sensitive to distinctions of culture, what counts as the correct morality in one society is not necessarily the same as what counts in another society with very different traditions. Political morality can be sensitive to culture broadly understood, but it cannot be sensitive all the way down. It must bottom out in principles that are claimed to be universal. Consider, by way of an example, what I suppose is the most extravagant version of cultural relativism that we could imagine. Consider the following theory. Political morality of a particular community must be a morality that reflects, has roots in, resonates with shared understandings and a shared history. Full stop. That sounds tremendously parochial. But since it's a moral claim, we must ask, why? Why is that so? And many answers are in principle available. We might say, for instance, what some anthropologists have said, cultural diversity is itself something worthwhile. Different communities have different cultures and hence different kinds of institutions, and it is a very good thing that there be that kind of diversity for any number of reasons. That's, you might say, a collective rather than an individual claim. But there are individual claims we might make. We might say that a society which has not known democracy will be riddled with tensions, will become inefficient, will become unstable if an attempt is made to engraft democracy on a culture resistant to it. We hear this quite a bit. We hear it about Asian values. Mr. Businessman called Mr. Lee wrote an extremely interesting op-ed piece in the New York Times a couple of months ago, explaining that the Chinese conception of democracy is very different from ours because the Chinese believe that democracy is a means, whereas he said, you in America somehow seem to think it's an end in itself. And he offered that as an explanation for the massacre of Tiananmen Square. There are other possible explanations, justifications for this paradigm of cultural relativism. We might talk about people's expectations. We might talk about people's sense of dignity being connected to continuity with their ancestors. The world is full of explanations of that sort. But one thing that must be true about each of them is that it must claim universal dominion. They claim that diversity of culture is something good in itself. Can't itself be thought to be parochial or culture relative, because then we would have an infinite regress of explanation. Relativity must bottom in a universal claim. We cannot, if we're talking about morality rather than simple anthropology, our moral conviction must in the end be universal in their claim. Now, how deep can relativity go? When must it bottom out? Here's a suggested answer. Relativity must come to a point at which it deploys principles of moral valence. Principles of moral valence are those that answer the question, when, morally speaking, are things getting better and when are they getting worse? That doesn't demand a consequentialist answer, though consequentialist answer would serve. A principle of moral valence may be a Kantian kind of claim about intrinsic respect for human beings, or it may be a claim about the prosperity of community. But again, a claim of moral valence is indispensable at some point. You can't have a moral theory without an understanding of when things are getting better or getting worse, morally speaking. And any such theory of moral valence must be universal in its claim, or it can't do the work it has to do to make a theory a moral theory. Now, I emphasize that because the two basic principles of liberalism are principles stating moral valence. The first principle says what counts as going better has to do with the fate of individual people, and the fate of each must count the same when coercion is in point. The second principle argues what counts as things going better for an individual. It says that must be left person by person to the person whose life it is. These are statements of moral valence. They may be wrong, but they can't be right for some and wrong for others. If liberalism is true for some, if it's true for us, it's true for everyone. Is it true for us? I've argued that it is true. Indeed, I've offered an argument in the Hedgehog's book, which I'm now going to summarize. I find that argument absolutely compelling. And here it is. We're talking, remember, about coercion, about people in power forcing other people to do what they do not want to do. Coercion is justified only when certain conditions are met. Coercion is justified only when it is consistent with the dignity of the person coerced. It cannot be consistent with his dignity unless it treats his fate as important as anybody else's. Otherwise, it's a form of slavery and inconsistent with dignity. It cannot be consistent with dignity if it usurps that person's judgment about what it is to take his interest into account as an equal. Now, as I say, I find that perfectly compelling. I admit reluctantly that you may not. But if you don't, then you have another theory of what justifies coercion. That is a theory of moral valence, and that theory, whatever it is, must be universal. I might take a moment to warn against a certain mistake that might be possible at this point. I think it's a mistake, and that is to say, we can't talk about political moralities, liberalism or any other, as true or false. They're entirely subjective. And because they're subjective, they can only be different, not right or wrong, not true or mistaken. Time is now short, so I can't be polite. That view is incoherent. It's incoherent because skepticism of that form is itself a moral position. To say there can't be right or wrong is to say the rich have no obligation to help the poor. That they do have an obligation to help the poor is a moral claim. No matter how fancy we get with ontology, no matter how much we talk about the distinction between meta-ethics and ethics, it remains true that someone who says there is no right and wrong in this neighborhood is denying that rich people have an obligation to help the poor. He understands the language, he must, and he's denying it. So, impolite, incoherent. I want to end with an observation. That is, I began these remarks by talking about politicians in the West, a lot of them in the United States, I confess, who talk about exporting our values to the rest of the world. Exporting, we might say, our liberal attitudes to the rest of the world. But if we understand liberalism in terms of the two principles, we can hardly say with a straight face that we have achieved liberalism. The welfare state in this country, admirable, I believe, could be seen as an attempt to distribute in accordance with the hypothetical insurance. I think it can be. I think that was the Fabian instinct behind the development of the welfare state here. But if we look at it that way, we must agree that it's dramatically underfunded and getting worse day by day. In the United States, we celebrate the generosity of our conception of free speech. But our Supreme Court so misunderstood what free speech is about that it held that our Constitution demands that corporations be allowed to give unlimited sums to political campaigns. That's in fair, striking distance of corrupting our democracy beyond repair. And it's an extremely illiberal understanding of free speech. In France, I've discovered by reading about the recent election, the odious Monsieur Le Pen was convicted of a crime for saying that the Nazi occupation of France was not inhumane. That's a repellent view. But we can't suppose in any fidelity to the basic principles of liberalism that it's a criminal offense. We should stop talking about exporting liberalism for a while and begin to think about importing liberalism. From where? From the only place we can. From universal, timeless, objective, moral truth. Where else? Thank you for your patience.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me all right at the back? I'm sure you will agree with me that that was an extraordinary tour de force. Done noteless. My comments will not be so noteless because Professor Dworkin was kind enough to give me some advance warning of his main line of argument, and it helped me to compile some notes which I think will be sure to come into his category of incoherent. And he, early on in his remarks, quoted and criticized Isaiah Berlin. And I'm reminded that once when going from Oxford to LSE to give a lecture in the early post-Cold War years on the subject of international norms, I found myself standing at the bus stop in the High Street next to Isaiah Berlin. And I couldn't resist the opportunity to get a line from him as to what I should say at LSE. I said, are there any such things as universal norms? And Isaiah said, no. There's no such thing as a universal norm. The only quality that is universally admired is courage, and that's deeply ambiguous. So that was his answer to today's question. And today we've had a rather more inspiring and encouraging answer, which is that liberalism is of universal value. And I start out from a sympathy with that position. Indeed, today I was reading, as is my habit, a report from the Canadian Parliament, which was giving an award recognising the extraordinary achievements of Metropolitan Sheptytsky in the Second World War in saving the lives of many Jews. And it referred to human rights as mankind's highest obligation. And again, I have deep sympathy with that approach. It's a noble expression of not just an important point of view, but a fundamental value. Now, I still have to confess that I have a bit of trouble with the presentation that we have just heard from Ron Dworkin. He laid out the central question before us with absolutely characteristic clarity. He said, our question is whether liberalism is only a parochial political morality with roots and authority in only part of the world, not, as many of us think, a universal political morality with authority everywhere. Now, my purpose in these initial remarks is to suggest a slightly different framing of the question, and I'll suggest a slightly reframed version at the end. On the way there, I'll try and indicate where I wholeheartedly agree with Professor Dworkin and where I have some reservations. Professor Dworkin makes it crystal clear that his advocacy of a universal political morality is not the same as advocacy of particular actions, whether they be trade boycotts or military interventions, etc., to end practices we dislike. So this is not an argument about intervention. However, at risk of making a cheap point, I should say that there's a long history of a belief in the universal value of liberal ideas being associated inextricably with patterns of interventionism. This nexus has continued in our own time with interventions, Western interventions in Kosovo, East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq. Now, you may take different views of each of these, and I'm not criticizing them all. Some I have great sympathy and support for. But because of that nexus, I am perhaps more wary than Professor Dworkin about proclaiming the universality of liberalism as a foundational political idea. If, despite my note of concern, we agree on the principle that this is not a discussion about interventionism, we also agree that liberalism, which this discussion certainly is about, is both an important concept and one that is very hard to define. It's certainly not for me to go into the different meanings of liberalism in any detail, but I do just want to note a difficulty, which was also noted by Professor Dworkin, about the sheer complexity of getting a formal agreed definition of what liberalism is. The term is encrusted with a huge number of barnacle-like connotations, nowhere more so than, as he indicated, in the United States. Indeed, so much so that the American inner-city political joke has some real resonance. A question, what is the definition of a liberal? Answer, a decent person who hasn't been mugged yet. If one ignores the whole question of connotations, even basic meanings of the term can vary. The meaning pursued in this discussion can be put reasonably simply. It refers to a political philosophy that emerged in modern and still recognizable form in the late 18th century, and the essence of it is a belief in liberty as the key condition of intellectual, social and economic growth, and in progress as an attainable outcome from it. The main, perhaps the only, constraints on liberty that are accepted are those that are embodied in an agreed framework of law, administered with impartiality and integrity. And that's why Professor Dworkin does something really valuable when he seeks to refine liberalism, as he has done here today, into two basic principles, which I remind you are stated as coercive government, and note that interesting emphasis on coercion, is not legitimate unless it meets the two conditions. It shows equal concern for the fate of all those under its dominion, and unless it acknowledges and facilitates the responsibility of all those to define for themselves their own conception of how to live well. Now, one may, I think, legitimately wonder how even reduced to this essential core, how universal these two principles can be. Even long-established, democratic, and, yes, liberal polities may fail to meet the high standards of these two basic principles. The question of whether or not a government shows equal concern for the fate of all those under its dominion is precisely what is in contention, whether one is discussing the budget, the excessive power of the Murdoch press, the provision of protective equipment to our troops in Afghanistan, or the residential arrangements of gypsies. And to what extent did we wish in the past to extend to Catholics, or do we wish today to extend to Muslims or Hindus or others the right to define for themselves how to live well? Similar questions arise, if in subtly different forms, in other liberal democracies, including, of course, in France. So I end up being even more cautious than Professor Dworkin about whether there can be an agreed and universal definition of liberalism. But there certainly is a universalist streak in liberalism. There's a general tendency in political theory anyway to work from first principles, to work out what the good life consists of, and to devise a political system of universal applicability. That's a characteristic of political science, or of much political science, and liberalism has been very much part of that approach. And since at least the 17th century, many enunciations of liberal interventionism, whether by politicians or writers, have been worryingly general in character. The US Declaration of Independence, 1776, famously, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Wonderful words, but with an implication of universality. Now, not for nothing was the UN's first declaration, the first document on human rights after the Charter, called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It couldn't be anything other than universal. The whole point of it was to establish that there are basic human rights that should apply to all societies and to get a minimum agreement on what they are. And in no way do I want to mock this universalist streak. As a matter of record, all those political philosophers, and there have been many, who have pronounced that certain types of people were not yet ready for the practice of democratic politics, have been proved wrong in one respect or another. At various times, more or less serious academics have said that of Asians, of Arabs, of Catholics, that they're destined towards authoritarian rule and nothing can change that. Yet events in many countries, Korea, Spain, Portugal, one could go on with a very long list, show that that negative approach, a denial of the applicability of Western or generally universal liberal ideas, is itself simply wrong, and that there is a general attraction there. even states clinging on to systems of one-party rule often go to some lengths to pay at least lip service to liberal ideas and decencies. So it's obvious that I don't think that liberalism is only a parochial political morality with roots and authority in only part of the world, to use the exact words of the initial question we were asked. Does it follow, then, that the alternative is to view it as a universal political morality with authority everywhere? Again, quoting Ron Dworkin's words. My answer, I'm afraid, is no. It isn't a universal political morality. True, no society is immune to liberal ideas. Maybe one could even say that no society is immune to their ultimate implementation. But liberal ideas always have to compete with others, and other ideas do sometimes have a logic to them, especially in deeply divided societies in which distrustful communities jostle for power. There is often a case for a degree of authoritarian rule. This is not a matter of one part of the world being inherently different from others. Even in our own, I hope, relatively liberal polity of the United Kingdom, we imposed direct rule on Northern Ireland for most of the time between 1972 and 2007 because of the unsatisfactory problems of the relationship arising from the relationship between majority and minority communities. In some countries, such as Singapore, a somewhat authoritarian version of democracy flourishes, and because it flourishes, will be very difficult to change. And it's true also, as Tim mentioned in introducing this today's event, that new powers don't necessarily subscribe to a single core of liberal values, newly emerging powers. And it's also noteworthy that when liberal ideas do get implemented in authoritarian societies, they often get implemented piecemeal. Liberal ideas in culture or within particular areas of society, in universities or whatever, rather than being implemented as a general philosophy. We are not, it seems to me, yet at a stage where it's wise to claim that a political idea is universal. Ideas of the world consisting of a plurality of types of political system still themselves have some moral value. This was put eloquently by my predecessor, but two, as Montague Burton Professor, all in an article in Foreign Affairs, all the way back in 1972, and that was, of course, at the time of the Vietnam War, which he was deeply critical of. And he wrote then, "The world is still divided into different political and cultural civilizations, and the main rationale and function of a multiple balance in the past has been to preserve the freedom of its members while minimizing the risks and scale of war. The autonomous state of civilization has a great deal of vitality, and we are more likely to live in relative tranquility if we respect differentiation while opposing the temptations of universality for our own values or the claims of other polities." In conclusion, then, coming back to Professor Dworkin's original question, I would say liberalism is not just a parochial political morality with roots and authority in only part of the world, but is rather one political morality with appeal everywhere, but which must necessarily coexist and compete with other political moralities. Thank you very much.
Now, I think that with ideas as well as with people, we should avoid guilt by association. It's perfectly true that the issue I spoke about is often confused with the question of intervention at many different levels, military, economic, voluntary boycotts and so forth. And it may be that talking, as many of my presidents have done, about universal values is dangerous politics. But that's not our issue here. Our issue is whether it's true or false that liberalism has the universal authority that I claim. I meant also to say that we're not talking, not only are we not talking about intervention, we're not talking about blame. Abraham Lincoln, the saint of emancipation, once said that, of course, a white man should not sit down to table with a black man. We find that repulsive, but we don't blame Lincoln, I think. It's all very different from the question that we're discussing, which is whether it's right or wrong. The second point I want to make is to emphasize the importance of disentangling various questions. One is the question of whether we perforce will find ourselves having to accommodate and live with different conceptions of political morality, competitive conceptions. Of course we will. That is our situation. But we mustn't confuse whatever accommodation we make, however that affects, as it should affect, our decisions about even rhetoric. We mustn't confuse that with the question of whether it is what our rivals say is true, whether it's right, that what's true for us is not true for them. And I think we have to be very careful intellectually to separate the practical questions and indeed the historical questions. Will we ever achieve liberalism from the question of how we should define liberalism and what is to be said in its favor? How we should define it. I agree that it is very unlikely that we could come to an agreed statement. I offered two principles. I said maybe you will disagree with them, then you should supply others. It isn't, it seems to me, important whether we will precisely agree on them. What is important is that we try to achieve some clarity in what our claims are and to make the best case we can for those claims. Now, Adam said that in some parts of the world, there is a case for a degree of authoritarian rule. Here's where the disentanglement is very important. This could mean a case for living with it, or it might mean a case for it. If there's a case for it, if there's a moral argument in its favor, then that moral argument will have to find roots in more general moral principles. And if it can be found in the two principles I described, which might, given the circumstances, happen, then we can endorse it. Otherwise, we will say, regrettably, Singapore will continue. Doesn't mean that we have to say there's a case for Singapore, unless we can make out a case other than in the fact that we have it and we have to live with it. Finally, what is the role? Something I didn't talk about, but terribly interesting. What is the role in all of this of history? What is the role of the fact that liberalism emerged as a distinct and identified political morality at an identified time? I think that's important for what I tried to say earlier. When that history gave us an assumption, a shared assumption, that there's a value somewhere in the neighborhood that we each try and get at with our unpersuasive definitions. That's an important fact. But it isn't important that the understanding we now promote of liberalism be like that which was promoted in the 18th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Adam, I think with your permission, I'll throw it open, but just to state again that one of the questions on the table is whether a plurality of political systems or models is itself something potentially desirable in the way that Isaiah Berlin argued that a plurality of individual values was itself desirable. I'm sure there will be many questions. If you could please identify yourself and ask, for preference, short questions rather than long statements. At the back, Rasmus Nielsen, there's a mic.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring and rich lecture, Professor Dworkin. I have a very simple question in a way. Do you think it's in any way a problem for your argument that its force, if you will, seems to rely on the idea that people who do not agree with you simply do not get it? That they are either, at best, suffering from false consciousness or at worst in bad faith?
They certainly don't have to be in bad faith to disagree with me. I think I'll turn this off. I've known people to disagree with me in perfectly good faith.
It's on. It's okay.
But no, I don't find it. I would find it surprising if people agreed with me in great masses. It's one of my more theoretical claims that these concepts, liberalism, justice, democracy, are what I've called interpretive concepts. That is, we share them, but we disagree in the large very often, and almost always in detail, about the best interpretation of them. And I think that the disagreement in interpretation is very valuable.
Thank you very much. Daniel.
Daniel Johnson, editor of Standpoint. You mentioned in the course of your remarks that there were different kinds of liberalism. You mentioned in particular classical liberalism and what you called egalitarian liberalism or social democracy. And one gathered, you said that you thought there was a right answer as to which was fully entitled to the claim. You didn't quite spell that out, but I assume that you feel that the egalitarian form of liberalism has a better claim to it. But under your principles, and you also mentioned Obamacare as a good example, perhaps, of the insurance principle, but under your two basic principles, I can just about see how mandatory health insurance could be justified. I can see no case at all for how you could justify forcing, for example, Catholics or evangelicals, institutions to provide services under Obamacare, which contradict their basic religious principles. So my question really is egalitarian liberalism really capable of observing your two principles?
Thank you. Well, it will be controversial in any case, whether the two principles. As Adam said, people disagree about what equal concern is and means. In a particular case that you mentioned, I believe that Catholic institutions should not be required to provide abortions. And that is the view of the Obama administration. It's a distinct question. Here's where the controversy lies. Whether if a Catholic hospital takes out group insurance plan for its employees, whether that insurance plan can be required to provide abortion services. Now, that's very different. I take the view that that is not engaging the hospital in violating its principles. So I don't have trouble with that particular case, but I certainly agree there'll be very hard cases.
Now, I already have about 7 people who want to ask questions. So with your permission, Ronnie, I may group them in groups of 3.
I'll talk less.
Michael, I think you can probably manage without the mic from here. Michael
Frieden. I want to put a very simple proposition here. The proposition is that the parochial view of liberalism is that it's universal. Shall I repeat?
Yes, please.
Okay. Michael Frieden. My simple proposition to you is that a parochial view of liberalism is that it is universal. Because universalism is itself a notion that derives from and is located in particular cultural contexts.
Yes. Oh, thank you.
Can somebody hold that one, or do you want to?
Yeah. Oh, yes. No.
Yeah. Jeremy, could you sling the mic down? Sorry.
children from All Souls. Ronnie, at the beginning you mentioned the possibility that liberal values may resonate in some social settings and not in others. And I wonder whether we didn't brush past that a little bit too quickly. The respect principle talks about the self-constitution of an individual life. And we can imagine social settings where that really makes sense to an awful lot of people and strikes them as tremendously important. And other social settings where that seems like an idiosyncratic concern or a marginal concern, or for many people is largely unintelligible because they think about their lives in ways that are quite different from that. So I wondered what you thought about that, because it looks as though the respect principle, the second of the two principles that you mentioned, requires us to pay attention to a facet of people's lives that may not be as central always for them as the principle makes it appear. And this might indicate that liberalism, in some sense, has limited scope, because there is a deeper principle that has universal scope. And the deeper principle, a sort of a pre-liberal principle, is pay attention to people's lives in terms that make sense to them. Yeah? And that we would accept as a universal, say, necessary condition on fundamental moral valence. But it might yield the conclusion that these specifically liberal principles, fundamental though they are, will apply perhaps in some circumstances, not in others, perhaps in some eras and not in others.
Thank you, Jerry. We'll take one more.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'm so sorry. I thought you waved to me earlier. Pablo Eleftheriadis, Mansfield College. The form of your argument seems to be not limited to political principles. You defined your first two principles as principles of legitimacy of coercive exercise of coercion by within dominion. Nevertheless, the principles of moral valence could easily apply to any ethical principle. We make these distinctions even in interpersonal or simply personal assessments of our virtue or of our lives. So doesn't your argument take you to ethical universalism as well?
I find the suggested paradox enticing, but yes, universalism is in one sense parochial. It's unpopular in a lot of places, particularly universities. It's very popular in illiberal societies. Universalism has its most enthusiastic reception in tyrannies. That was, I think, the point of Two Concepts of Liberty, the great essay in which pluralism made its particular appearance in our diction. It doesn't mean that universalism is itself parochial. Whether it's parochial is not a sociological question about where and how enthusiastically it's received. It's a moral question, and I'm trying to answer it. My answer is, at a certain level, moral principles have to be universal, or the whole house of cards collapses. Now, Jeremy's point about shouldn't we have a pre-liberal principle that says political authority should be exercised somewhere, makes sense to them, makes sense to the people. Well, I find makes sense ambiguous. Does it mean can be endorsed by them, in which case it's just the second principle all over again, and I like it. If it means make sense to them in a way that is, the fact is due to the fact that they don't believe that they should think about and endorse a way of life, ancestor worship, for example. If they think that is part of what makes my life go well, then if liberalism says, be our guest. On the other hand, if the pre-political liberalism says they're stuck with it, we don't ask them to understand or endorse the values that are reigning over them, then I disagree with it. It's not only a pre-liberal, it's an anti-liberal principle. Now, on valence and personal morality, yes, that is certainly so. When I say that the liberal principles are political principles and principles about coercion, I don't mean that there aren't universal ethical principles, universal moral principles. I think there are. I've tried to defend some of them. But they're different principles. As I said, I don't have to have the same concern for your children as I have for mine. That's a matter of personal morality. It's because I'm not in a position to exercise power over you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Beautiful, sir.
In my many discussions with the late Jerry Cohen, I would, at a suitable stage, introduce the concept of the real world, which he always rejected as a red herring. Could I dangle this red herring before your nose with the following question? If, as you say, liberal values are political values, they require political institutions or devices for their implementation. What are the minimum political conditions, the minimum institutional conditions, when you've stripped out all community-specific variations, all legitimate community-specific variations, for ensuring that liberal values can prevail to the benefit of all or most? My own shortlist would be respect for the individual person, which is, of course, in the history of the world a revolutionary idea, the rule of law, and the accountability of the governors to the governed. And that's my shortlist. My question is, does it satisfy you? Do you want it shorter still or longer?
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry if I've failed to grasp this, and it may be because you had to condense your argument, and if I read the book I probably will understand it better. But as I understood your two principles, the state can use coercive power as long as it takes account of equally of the interests of all, and at the same time it has to allow each to define his or her interests for his or herself. And that second bit, I'm not quite clear how it works. Supposing I define my interests or my idea of the good life as one in which I can have 4 wives, or I have authority in my family and will not allow girls to go to, my daughters to go to swimming classes with my sons, or a number of other things like that. I think you get my drift. I'm not quite clear how the state, in using its coercive power, goes about respecting those views that I might have.
Simon Head, Oxford and NYU. Ronnie, I want to focus on the concept of dignity, which featured very prominently in your discourse. And you define dignity, it seemed to me, as the right of people to decide how they would live well and make something of their lives. And I recall that Bernard Williams, in the great essay he wrote at the end of his life, Philosophy as a Humanist Discipline, used exactly the same form of words. I also recall that you, in the conference we had with the New York Review in Oxford, used the word tyranny to describe the growing inequality of wealth and power in the American capitalist economy, and one could say the same thing in the British. I would put it to you that one of the aspects of this tyranny is that an increasing proportion of the population is being denied the economic preconditions of dignity. And these preconditions require a certain education to make your way in the capitalist economy, the availability of work, and when work exists, that it should have a certain dignity. And it seems to me that we are, in the capitalist economy, moving into a kind of radical instrumentalism in the deployment of labor, which actually is a threat to dignity. So my question is, how far are we away from a situation where the growth of what you've called a tyranny undermines the liberal legitimacy of American or British capitalist society?
Thank you. Now, prelude to my answer, I'm very fond of herring. And I've never had a red herring, but particularly one dangled in front of me, but I certainly would try it if I had the opportunity. I wouldn't now say that I want a longer or a shorter list. I want a more sensitive list. That is, in some communities, I would say that judicial veto over legislation is an institutional, if not requirement, at least that it's enormously recommended in that community. Where you had, for example, to use a now immortal phrase in a footnote in a Supreme Court opinion, where you have impacted, isolated, and discrete minorities, I would say that the institutional arrangement cannot be fully majoritarian and achieve liberal consequences. In other communities, it may be very different. So I think I agree with you that the real world is important, but, as Kant said, we have to have ideas in the back. We've got to have theories in the back. Now, the distinction that Ruud Mortimer suggests is this. If someone says, I need 4 wives to make my life complete, it follows from liberal principles that government must not say to him, you are wrong in your view about what makes your life go better. However, it's our job, taking at face value that that's how you define it, it's our job to protect other people from your pursuit of that way of life. That's a distinction, I think, crucial to liberalism. That is, liberalism rejects the false consciousness view. It rejects the idea we know better than you what's in your good. But it certainly does not endorse the idea that you can have whatever you think is in your good, because equal concern requires a discipline to protect the rights of others. In this case, 3 of the 4 wives. Simon, yes, I agree about the tyranny. I think that we don't have to look to the consequences downstream of a terribly unjust distribution of wealth to see whether it threatens dignity. I think that to run a coercive legal order, to take taxes from people, to limit them via the criminal and civil law, in a society in which they are being denied the economic resources that equality would require, is in and of itself an insult to their dignity. Now, you're quite right that the downstream consequences of that in many societies deprives people of education and corrupts their ability to live a decent, dignified life in other ways. I would agree with that. We don't have to reach that point. We have tyranny enough at the start.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are running out of time, so I am going to select on the principle of equal voice. In other words, to start with someone slightly younger, Jeff Howard.
Hi, I'm Jeff Howard. I'm a DPhil student in political theory at Nuffield College. Professor Dworkin, you mentioned Abraham Lincoln earlier, and it strikes me that if you or I had been born in a similar context to Lincoln, you or I could also share the idea that it would be impermissible morally or inappropriate in some way to share a dining table with a black man. And I find that an extremely sobering notion, not because it impugns my belief in the universality of liberal values, but that it clarifies to me just how difficult it is to convince other people to accept liberal values. And so I wonder if you have any reflections on what our argumentative strategy should be in engaging people who don't hold liberal values to think about endorsing those values.
Shoot the microphone across to Dominic Burbage here, same row, if you fling it along.
Thanks very much. Just a question about what is the role of a good citizen in this view? So is it firstly to speak about one's own conception of the good life, or is it to speak only about where coercive government is illegitimate? Or finally, would it be to listen to other people's conception of the good life?
So I'm the female equal voice, Catherine Bennett from the Catherine Bennett from the International Herald Tribune. I was wondering whether, even though we probably all agree that there is no such thing as a perfectly liberal society today and probably in history, whether you can cite an example from history and perhaps also from the present that would have come closest to your ideal version of society.
Yeah. Okay. Argumentative strategy. I think we have to start by distinguishing persuasion from argument. They're not necessarily the same thing. There's when we are here trying to find out what's true, we're not concentrating, and we would do better not to concentrate on what will be persuasive. Unfortunately, as American politics demonstrates amply, what is persuasive is often of such low quality, jingles, and that, so the question is, how far should we demean ourselves by adopting techniques of persuasion which ought not to be effective because they are effective? And I say, in my view, we should go very far down that road. The stakes are very high. And if our politicians are going to use liberal as a dirty word, then maybe we should practice saying conservative with a sneer in our voice. Should we be, the answer to the question about good citizens is all of the above. I would emphasize this. First, you said, should a good citizen proclaim his view of the good life and try and persuade others? I'm mainly concerned to say it shouldn't be made difficult for him to do that, but I don't think myself that good citizenship demands that, or certainly it shouldn't consist only in that. Politics, speaking out on justice, that is what good citizenship requires. Listening to others, yes, that's very important. We now connect the two questions because you're not going to be persuasive unless you listen to them. An example of a successful, you may be very surprised at this. I'm very partial to Norway.
I'm not surprised.
They've been through, I think, the decision, for example, of the government to argue for the insanity of this killer shows the subtlety of the society that says, let us brand this person as insane and therefore not to be imitated, rather than a martyr who might be imitated. Now, that's not the only reason I like Norway, but it's really achieved a decent society with the help of being perfectly homogeneous, almost perfectly homogeneous, that's under threat, and with the help of being extremely rich per citizen. Still, they've done very well.
That's almost a perfect note to end on. I apologize profusely to all those who didn't get a chance to ask their questions, but I do think that since this is the Dahrendorf Lecture, the last question should go to Lady Dahrendorf. So, Ellen, would you like to...
Do you want a mic?
Yeah, microphone is coming.
Thank you, Tim. And in a way, I'm raising the voice of Ralf Dahrendorf here, because what puzzled me always listening to you is the conviction that ultimately you can resolve the issue of liberty and equality. It seems to me that you're talking about a world without conflict, and there always is going to be conflict in human society, and at the end of the day, there's going to be a conflict between those two values, and I don't quite understand how you think you can eliminate that problem.
Don't. I'm not talking about eliminating conflict. Conflict persists.
Conflict, liberty, equality.
Oh, that conflict. Well, I eliminate it. Elimination, again, we come to the same ambiguity about, trying to talk people into accepting a certain view and figuring out what view it is that you ought to be defending. Now, I am not under an illusion that I will cause people, maybe a very few of them around the edges, to give up the idea that on the one hand, equality requires sacrifice of liberty, or on the other, that liberty, they won't give that up. They'll continue to say that. But I have to decide what my role in the argument is. And all I can do is tell you how I understand what has to be philosophically present in order for there to be a conflict. I don't think there can be a conflict between two values. Now, as Tim said, or he showed you a book, a very fat book, and that's the burden of the argument of that book. So I want to distinguish my case for there being no conflict here from my chances of persuading others to eliminate their ideas of the conflict. The first I'm quite tentatively pleased with. The second, of course, I don't think I can.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Adam, would you like to?
Enjoyed perhaps I could just comment on the issue of universalism, which we come back to, which is at the core of the discussion. Just to say, I thought Michael Frieden's question, is universalism always a form of parochialism, was very apropos. And it reminded me of that wonderful organisation, the Liberal International. And much of the work and records of the Liberal International would give comfort, I think, to Michael Frieden in his proposition. But I think the discussion tonight and the lecture we've heard suggests actually that there is a permanent tension between the appeal of a universal political idea, and liberalism has enormous appeal, and some of the difficulties of the real world that were put in front of us by Peter Pilzer and others. And I thought against that background, what we heard was fairly far from the pure parochialism that Michael posited.
Thank you very much, Adam. Once again, apologies to those who didn't have a chance of equal voice. If you're still wishing to speak, there are outside cards giving you the website address of our big free speech project, freespeechdebate.com, and we would welcome you all to come and give voice there. Professor Dworkin also has a website set up to respond to critics on his book. It's called Justice for Hedgehogs, all one word, .net. And one response to a rather, I think, generous reviewer, Conor Gearty, this is Professor Dworkin responding. It says, Conor Gearty, in equally generous comments, says that if I were a hotel, I would be the Savoy in London. That hotel, I note, this is Professor Dworkin speaking, was closed a few years ago as in urgent need of modernization. Open brackets. It has since reopened. Now, I have to tell you that my wife and I recently had the pleasure of staying at the reopened Savoy. I hasten to add, not at our own expense. And it is the most wonderful combination of tradition and modernity. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that that is what we have had this evening, in a truly memorable evening, one that Ralf Dahrendorf would immensely have enjoyed, both from our respondent, Adam Roberts, and especially from our Dahrendorf lecturer, Ronald Dworkin. Thank you both very much indeed.